super excited to have David LaFontaine and Ed Moore, both of whom are very accomplished UI UX designers with web and gaming backgrounds. And I'm just very excited to have a group discussion on how the old methods apply to this new technology and what new tools need to be invented to really allow creators, gamers, designers, tinkerers, web engineers, everyone to migrate to this new medium of spatial computing that's going to bleed over into, every area of our lives. So thank you both for joining, and would love maybe if you could give a quick intro of, your background and what pulled you into this world of immersive entertainment and immersive media.
Well, first of all, thanks for having us here. How pretentious do you want us to get? We're both UX designers, so we can seriously do that.
Well, you can level set, and then he can try to match that.
We both have the glasses and the beards for everybody at home who's listening.
Exactly. We didn't bring our berets today.
No berets.
But we do have chunky eye-frame glasses, so you can tell us apart.
We do, but they're not Warby Parkers.
Damn it. I knew I forgot something. So for me, going back to where did I get interested in immersive, how far back do we want to go? I've got a issue
to the primeval era.
Yes.
Primordial ooze.
Back to the Bhagavad Gita, where the entire of eternity was all an illusion, Maya. No, not that far back. The first time I really saw entertainment that was sparking something in me, and I'm going to go back here, was the movie Virtuosity with a very young Russell Crowe. I was on the set of that little rascal, and I'm like, there's something going on here. Then, of course, the whole Lawnmower Man thing back then, which, again, looked at virtual reality and was like, oh, my God, virtual reality will destroy the world.
There was a weird flirtation with virtual reality in the 90s at one point. It's very interesting from a historical perspective, but please continue.
Yeah, and then everybody was like, oh, my God, CD-ROMs, it's going to be like virtual reality. And if anybody out there remembers the whole CD-ROM craze, yeah, that was fun, right before the .com 1.0 crash. Since then, it's been kind of like the VR, AR industry. It's been kind of in fits and starts. We've had a number of false starts with this industry, but it finally looks like technology and content and user adoption are catching up to where our imaginations took us, Way back when, yeah.
Yeah.
How would you, Ed?
So I've been a lifelong gamer. Some of my earliest memories were playing an Atari 2600. So when I was in high school, I produced a television show about video games. It was like a video game review format show, magazine format. And during that time, I started playing, I remember playing Final Fantasy II on Super Nintendo and realizing that video games were really going to become a storytelling medium, that they weren't just going to be kind of simple arcadey experiences, that they were going to have characters, emotions, things like that. And I always kind of felt very gravitated towards that. So I still stayed in the television production lane for a little while. When I got to college, I started off as a communications major, but I basically transitioned into doing computer science. And the reason why I did that is because there wasn't a game design program or anything like that at that time. It was just like, if you wanted to make games, you had to learn how to program. So I did that, and then after graduating from college, I went to, my first job was in New York City. I worked on a little game called Monkey Magic for the original PlayStation. Worked after that, went back home to Boston, worked with Irrational Games. They make the BioShock series. I basically, like, over the past 20 years or so, I've been bopping around between different companies like EA and working with companies like Sega and Capcom, a lot of the big hitters in this field. And a couple of years ago, the video game industry is kind of challenging, and I got hit with kind of end-of-project layoffs, and I decided to freelance just to kind of pursue some entrepreneurial interests. And around that time, a lot of people in my network had been migrating towards VR. This is when the Oculus Rift Kickstarter had really blown up. Now Gear VR was kind of a thing, and just so many people in my network wanted that first mover advantage. So, and there are a lot of opportunities happening here in LA. So I started specializing. I'd done a lot of like user experience design in the realm of video games, and I wanted to take that experience and translate it into this new emerging medium. So it's a small community here in LA, but a very vibrant one. And so that's just kind of how I got drawn into the VR, AR, UX, spatial computing world.
Yeah.
So let's set some definitions for this discussion, because I would love to hear, from a gaming background and from more of a traditional web background, what is user experience? How would you define it?
The classic definition of user experience, people say, okay, if you walk up to a device like an ATM, and you see how big is the screen and where are the buttons and where are the slots where you put your card and where's the button, the slot where the money comes out of, that's UI, that's interface. UX is when you're walking away from that thing, how do you feel about the experience that you had? How did all those things come together? What did it work for you? Were you able to do what you needed to do without having to think about it? And one of the seminal books in the entire canon of UX design is called Don't Make Me Think. As we've found from a great deal of evolution across the web, it's all been about how do we refine what we're doing so that users don't have to spend so much time on thinking and they can spend their time on doing. And for any of you out there who are listening who remember the days of DOS, where you had to memorize these commands, CD / directory name, all those things to make computers do what you wanted them to do. And then the mouse and point and click interface came along, GUIs, and now we've had this, evolving field of study in UX, which is we want the computer to do something simple like find my file, open up the document, calculate the spreadsheet.
Book my flight.
Exactly. And, how many barriers are we making it for the user to have to jump through to get to what they want to do? Now, VR is going to be a very difficult thing to design for from a designer's point of view, because we've had these interfaces, but if you're talking about virtual reality, the whole point of it is there is no interface. You're basically in another reality, and we're used to being able to walk over to things, pick them up, put them down, doing stuff to them, but if they're not actually there, I don't care how much haptic feedback you get in. I saw they got a Haptic Vest now that just came out in the last couple of days.
Oh yeah, I've tried them. They're cool, especially with some of these kind of music video apps where they give you vibrating feedback to the actual music and stuff. I've seen some pretty cool stuff with that.
It's kind of like having your own massage chair that you carry around with you.
Yeah.
Sort of.
Must be interesting on Friday nights.
Definitely deepens the user experience.
It does.
Walking away from that.
Okay, who's going to be the first person to say the phrase teledildonics here? Okay, I was.
Wow,
sorry.
You went there, man.
Damn it, gotta go
early.
for the blue
We
material.
are 8.5 minutes in, and we got there.
Already mentioning dildos.
We usually end on that one.
Yeah, all right.
Well,
So,
go ahead.
so Ed, how would you distinguish, and specifically in terms of gaming, versus the traditional web design, where a lot of web designers think of UX or the UX design process as a very linear and regimented thing that circles back and is iterative. Do you find it similar in gaming, or are there clear distinctions in your mind?
So you're asking, are there distinctions or similarities between designing for video games versus designing for web?
Yeah, specifically with the evolution of the game engines towards reality engines, right?
Sure.
That will be creating this interfaceless virtual world.
Yeah, I tend to find it with in games, and what I've noticed is the difference when I've started freelancing and starting working with people outside of games, is that there's still this, Dave mentioned earlier about what the user interface is, which is what you see and touch and how it looks, right? And in games, I still find that there is still a little bit of fuzziness between that. A lot of times, especially in games media or news sites or websites, a lot of times that they talk about UX as being like quality of life improvements. So it's like making a process easier to do or having less friction or more intuitive, right? Because God knows there's tons of interfaces in games that are just very bulky and unwieldy, and some of them require some arcane combination of shoulder buttons and face buttons and analog sticks to make it do the thing that you're wanted to do, and somehow the average user is expected to be able to understand this, right? So what I find a big difference so that's one of the differences I find between people who are designing UI and UX for games and that people kind of outside of that. In recent years, we're starting to see a much greater shift towards games as a service rather than a box product. And I think you tend to see that kind of thinking more in the mobile and the website space where you're always iterating, you're always making improvements and such. So that kind of thinking is coming to a lot of games, especially like in the big box AAA retail. It's all about these kind of large multiplayer games that are these live ongoing services. So there really is never a ship date. So I think in some ways that's good. And we're seeing more data-driven approaches where we're really leveraging analytics and really putting a lot more emphasis on understanding what our customers need and how they act. I think in previous years in the video game industry, it wasn't like that. It was kind of more like the auteur designer with his vision, and everything is very divorced and separated between the users and the people making the game, because the marketing people don't want to reveal certain things because they've got this content strategy where they're going to be, here's our big reveals, and we can't talk to our customers. And I think that method of making games is going away, and I think that's a similarity that I'm seeing between how people make websites and apps and what's going on in the gaming area.
And do you see within these engines a return to skeuomorphic design where we're just adapting things we do in reality inside the engines, or do you feel like there is a better way? There's some new evolution of interface that we can run towards.
Yeah, I think that the Skew for people. Do you think people in your audience they know what skeuomorphism is?
No, let's define that. I should define that.
Okay. So if you may remember, a couple years ago there was a new update. I think it was iOS 7, and before iOS 7, all your buttons and like when you went into your calculator, all the buttons had depth to them. They had shading. They kind of were trying to replicate the feeling of interacting with a real calculator. Or you might go to your notepad, and your notepad with all your reminders would be yellow, and it would have like little holes on the side of it, like a notepad that you would use in school, right? A physical piece of paper. So that is skeuomorphism, where it's like a interface that is not real is attempting to assume the appearance of something real. And what happened was around that time, both Google and Apple started to evangelize what we call flat design now, where it's really about the purity of the function of your interfaces and just removing a lot of those distractions from it. So that's why you see, and this is really also tended now to influence a lot of games, even now that games are no longer having these very kind of chunky looking buttons or these some of them still do, but you're seeing more and more of these kind of very flat, very clean, very elegant, very approachable, low visual density type of design work that's happening in the game sphere. So in terms of are we going back to that with VR or spatial computing? I think it's a different paradigm altogether because I still think that when you're talking about skeuomorphic or flat interfaces, you're still talking about rectangles. We're so conditioned to interacting with rectangular media, whether it's books, whether it's TV, whether it's websites, whether it's mobile apps, that we're always thinking about rectangles and buttons and such. And when you're talking about VR and spatial computing or spatial interfaces, you really have to think spherical and organic. And that's why when Dave is talking about, doorknobs and handles and
levers and things like that in the real world, you don't, if you're not like typing on a keyboard or like on a calculator or something like that, really you're not pressing buttons that much. Or, okay, like an elevator. To Ed's point about skeuomorphic design, one of the reasons why we saw that shift away from it a couple of years ago to flat design was people had spent enough time working with computer interfaces that we no longer needed to make your address book look like your old trapper keeper, for God's sake. Because people had been working long enough with computers to go, okay, I don't need this. This is something that happens with every introduction of new technology. For any of you out there, go to Google, type in horsey, horseless carriage, and you'll see a classic example of skeuomorphic design from the automobile. When the cars first came out, they took like stuffed horse heads and put them on the front of the car so that the car looked like it had a horse's head sticking out of it. So when it went down the street, it didn't panic all the horses, and some yokel didn't go witchcraft and shoot it with his flintlock.
Kill it with fire.
The devil. So yes, whenever we get a new technology out there, the impulse always is to take the old technology and then just slap it onto the new technology platform and go, well, it worked there, let's try it on this one. Again, to what we were saying there, the challenge with VR and AR is it is a blending of the worlds. You are there. And so these artificial things that we've come up with, keyboards and mice
and rectangles and floating
yeah
panels and things like that, they don't really take advantage of what VR is good at, which is presence, the feeling that you are actually in an artificial reality that feels real, it feels responsive to you, it feels immersive.
Yeah. Now, that being said, you're still going to need to be able to do things there, because we can't have you, walking around in VR yet without tripping over the coffee table or stepping on the cat. That's MR, mixed reality. So
we'll get there.
We'll get there sooner or later. When we plug it into the back of our skulls there and go direct nerve induction. There has to be something there to do shortcuts. And we've talked about that, about wayfinding, navigation, moving from one place to the other, because we're not in physical space. And so we do need to move around in this thing in a way
that's intuitive.
Yes.
And it's so we still need abstraction is still necessary.
Yeah.
Like we still need that interface that allows us to quickly travel through a virtual museum or something like that, because we can't replicate the experience of physically one-to-one going through the actual spatial, the spatial museum in real life, because you're operating within, a box with a couple of lighthouse sensors that are defining the space that you're in. So we have to rely on abstraction to give us to think about what is it that users really want to do, what are the goals that they have, and do they want to see this exhibit or this beautiful virtual painting or this model, and how do we streamline the tasks that the user has to do to have that, to achieve their goal, in a way that's really intuitive and natural, so that they're not even thinking about it.
Yeah. The thing that Ed is talking about there, especially, that just resonates, is intuitive. It takes a lot of hard work to make something idiot-proof.
Make it simple.
Yeah. And this is one of the things that's all a part of UX that always makes people do what Ed and I are just doing right now, which is kind of look down at the floor, because remember all the times that we came up with what were just awesome, killer designs, and then we put them out in the really real world, and people went, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a bad afternoon.
And that gets the importance of iteration and feedback and analytics, which, it's early days in this mixed reality spectrum for even gathering that kind of data. So I wonder, how much of the innovations that you've seen thus far in designing these virtual worlds has come from kind of bottom-up user observational thinking versus top-down auteurish led, breakthroughs in design. Do you have an opinion on that, Ed?
Yeah, I think that we have built up a kind of body of best practices because with VR, it's less of an issue with AR, because AR is an open experience. The metaphor I like to use is that VR is like the holodeck on Star Trek, and AR is the Princess Leia Princess Leia hologram, not the algorithm, Princess Leia hologram from Star Wars, right? One is a very closed experience that's replacing your reality. Augmented reality augments your reality, overlays it. So I think that a lot of the constraints that are in VR, we've built up practices that can address motion sickness. And I think that we have a lot of good examples, and a lot of that is fueled by the research that people have done. I mean, I did, with one of my clients, I did a firsthand usability study with kids and their parents, and we wanted to see, like, okay, is this going to make people sick or not? And that led to, for example, one of my kind of common things or techniques that I suggest that we do when you're doing VR is to have a consistent visual frame or a grounding element. So, for example, when you're in a car is a very type of high motion experience, but you don't necessarily feel motion sick because you have a dashboard, you have the frame of the window. This provides a consistent visual grounding. It's the same thing with pilots when they're in planes, they have their cockpit. So those types of things can alleviate motion sickness. So I think that a lot of these, we've built up these practices through trial and error and iteration. And I think we're at a point where we're at kind of a critical mass of understanding where, like, how can we not make people sick? So that's the first thing.
It's an important foundation for a good user experience.
That is some user feedback where you see all your users rip off the goggles and headset and start barfing. Mm-hmm. You know that
kind.
Yeah, you got to take that one back in the shop. Yeah, it is a mix of the user testing and observing what happens when things get out in the really real world. A couple years ago, the one I remember was a VR experience of going down a rafting river and looking at the Grand Canyon. Then it got to the part where the canoe went over the waterfall, and at that point you could see everybody scream and fall out of the chair. This tells you where this point is, and maybe we might want to, unless your point is to make people scream and fall out of the chair, which is kind of fun in film.
Can be fun.
Yeah, it is fun doing that. As for like the auteur-led version of it, why, of course it is, and you may call Dave and Ed for that, for all your auteur
pinkies are extended.
Indeed they
Berets are going on.
Drop some knowledge on you.
Damn right. It is a mixture of them both, because it is such a new space right now. Once again, users don't know what they want until you give it to them. The famous quote from Henry Ford, if I asked my users what they wanted, I would have just built a faster horse. We've got to experiment with, okay, let's see how this works. Does it help to have something, I've heard it referred to as, cartoon off-screen, where, like, in the Tom and Jerry cartoons where they reach off-screen and magically come back with a giant mallet. Does that help? Is it better over your shoulders? Is it better on top of your head, somewhere out of your field of vision? Is it better below your waist? Where are we putting these menus, these toolbars, these shortcuts to interact with the environment that we need? The one that we were talking about and looking at earlier, which is now possible because you can see your hands in VR, which is having something attached to one or both of your hands so that you turn your hands and up pops a menu, up pops something to navigate with. That is super cool, and I think that that's going to help a lot of the problems that we've previously been doing with gaze.
Yes.
Yeah.
So this is a perfect segue to get specific, I think, with the real innovation. So you mentioned, attaching things to the wrist. What are the real breakthroughs or the best UX design experiences that you've seen in virtual or augmented reality thus far? What's really caught your attention? It could be micro moments, not necessarily whole experiences.
Yeah, I mean, my go-to is always Job Simulator, just because I think that gets a lot of things right. For people in the audience who may or may not be familiar with it, Job Simulator it's a game, and the idea is that you are in this sort of fictional future where jobs have been made obsolete, and you have these robots that are possibly serving you or possibly imprisoning you. It's kind of a little ambiguous on that point.
Oh, like the old short story with folded hands. Yes.
I don't know if I saw that one.
No, it's an old one. It's never mind. It's about a future in which the robots basically they ripped it off for the iRobot movie, which is like the robots get advanced enough so that they realize that the best way to like protect humanity is to keep us from doing anything. So
yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
So anyway, in this game, you basically start out in this room and you have this, it looks like a game console, and you have cartridges, and it's like job simulator, and you can grab, okay, I'm going to be a burger flipper, okay, or I'm going to work at the gas station, or and what it basically is that once you put in the game and you start it, you have your own virtual hands, and you have everything is kind of within that bubble of reaching. And like imagine you're making burgers, like orders come in and you have to use tools and you have to flip the burgers, and then you have to grab the condiments and you have to put them up, and then you have to serve everything up on the plate. And it's all just really supernatural and intuitive. And these are very complex interactions that you're expected to learn. But it just works because it's like as you would be in the real world. If you're working in a 7-Eleven, it's like you just get it. And so I think that game really kind of, because a lot of times you would still see like floating menus and things that you have to point and click at, and then again is that evocative of that rectangular thinking. And there is some of that, like in Job Simulator, you do see like a sign that has instructions on it, and that gives you information about what you need to do. I mean, but I think that people are going to be looking back on that game for a long, long period of time of like one of the first really compelling use cases.
It's a very interesting case study before you jump to the next, because Alchemy Labs has specifically talked about their design process, and it was incredibly iterative in terms of really focusing on going an inch wide and a mile deep with rewarding users' intuitions, which I think is something that we could all learn in designing our own experiences, because you really just have to prototype, get it out there, and watch what people want to do. And the more that you see what people's intuition, where it guides them within an environment, you then build towards that and reward that intuition. And if you string together those rewards for long enough, people just go deeper and deeper and deeper into the immersion. And pretty soon, if there's nothing within 10, 20 minutes that breaks immersion for you, because everything you reach out and try to do is interactive and it reacts the way that you want it to, suddenly you have a really compelling simulation of reality. And I think that's what Job Simulator gets absolutely right.
Yeah, for sure. So, I completely agree with that. The other one that I also talk about is Tilt Brush. Tilt Brush is basically like painting in 3D space, and I think that's also another really, really great example, a use case of a VR user experience that's really awesome.
Yeah, and you probably saw that some sculptor like 3D printed out the sculpture that he did of a human head in Tilt Brush this last week. Yeah, I was like, yeah, that actually makes sense. The first time I started using that a couple of years ago, I'm like, oh yeah, this is going to be great for virtual sculpting. Needs a little bit of fine control here still, needs a little bit of responsiveness, but you can see where this is going. For me, for VR, I mean, it depends upon the format. I mean, what we were talking about a second ago with Gaze, if you're having a stripped down, if you don't have the controllers, the hand controllers, Gaze is what you got. We were talking last time now about how people are trying to integrate voice into it, which is getting better and better, as we're all finding, although, conversations with Siri don't make all that sense that much yet.
I
still
hate Siri.
Yeah,
I've changed her accent to British, and it doesn't make it better.
well,
It's a little better. It's a little more
How
pleasant.
do these, artificially intelligent bots and, just the technology that's being developed to service these immersive experiences for non-playable characters and that sort of thing, how do they affect the user's experience in it?
Deep question.
Yeah, I think that when you're using voice activation, like AI is involved with that, obviously, but you always need to have a backup method, because as Dave pointed out, that Siri fails us sometimes and often.
Yeah.
And so you need to have an alternate means of achieving that goal. Otherwise, you're creating friction. So it's still like, I still think there's a ways to go for that, where
And
it's
it
like
feels like
completely
that-
frictionless.
Yeah, and that war is being fought on multiple fronts, not just in VR and AR, but
Yeah.
on our mobile phones, as you mentioned with Siri and Google Now, trying to surface the right information at the right time, right? Ostensibly, it'll keep getting better and better.
Yeah.
But in the meantime, we need those alternative routes built in that are tried and true that we understand.
Yeah, and hopefully we don't poison the well so much with bad interactions there that the audience gets accustomed to doing the thing that I'm sure everybody out there does when they hear the robot voice on the phone, which is frantically start pushing the 0 button to try to reach a human being.
Yeah.
Yeah, because and it's gotten better. It's gotten better, but still there are times when you're doing something that's mission critical and you just need to talk to a human being to talk through this process that you're going through. And in the VR, AR environments, that would be, okay, we need to have some sort of more direct control rather than voice control with this. Now, what does that look like? One of the places that I've been seeing a lot of advances being made in this is in AR, the dashboards, the menu systems in defense, in the Department of Defense, which is also coming into heads-up displays in cars, because that's, you got to come correct on that one. You get it wrong, and
People are dying.
yeah, bad things. You don't want the guy piloting the drone to hit the "I'm feeling lucky" button there before he fires the missile. That's just a bad day. So that gets to another part of UX, which we were talking about before we got here, which is all about information architecture, which is just a fancy way of saying prioritization. You figure out what it is that you got to show people, in what order, in what categories, how you're going to be putting it in front of them, so that they can make the decision quickly without having to think again.
Yeah.
And that's all about, well, it's prioritization, and then kind of what
Requirement gathering.
yeah, and kind of what you guys were talking about, which is a really interesting iteration of it, which is looking at this process that we're doing, bringing in AI to have what we're designing there to be kind of like a really crowdsourced large virtual card sort. For those of you out there who don't know what a card sort is, that's basically what we do on websites. You get all the pages on a website and you put them on little 3x5 cards and you put them on a table with somebody and you say, okay, here's all the pages, all the categories on this website. How would you organize it so that, the person can find, okay, there's the home button, the, file view, whatever else, what goes underneath these categories, what goes with what, and in what order. And that way you're getting the users to start organizing, this is where I expect to find that. Because if you leave it up to designers, it makes perfect sense for us, to put the wine glasses in the silverware drawer, but that's not where a human being would expect to find them. But we're like, no, they belong in there because that way they won't get broken.
So how does then translating that thinking to a three-dimensional space change how you go about designing the information architecture?
I think that there is, with some of the tools that are out there for 3D tools, game engines like Unity and Unreal, they have heat maps, which are very similar to heat maps that you get in websites, tracking where users are going, what they're doing. And they're actually very highly customizable. You can track spatially where a user wanders or where specific interactions are occurring. So I think that in common, you can, if you have that and you get that data from how users are going through your environment, and you combine that with some sort of observation of the user themselves, whether it's through contextual inquiry, which is where the person who is interacting with a piece of software is vocalizing their thoughts in the moment rather than 20 minutes later during the interview, you can get a sense of what kind of experience is the user having in that environment, in that virtual environment at that moment. And that feedback loop of integrating users into your design process, I think, leads to those insights where you're getting better designed experiences.
Yeah. what Ed was talking about there with heat maps, analytics, that's one of the things that I've kind of made a focus of in the last couple of years, just because I saw there was such a glaring need for people to really start getting quantitative about what they're doing, what the designs are doing, and what I've observed to be the utter reticence of a lot of places full of designers to actually look at charts
It's
and
scary,
graphs.
man.
The art versus science of
Yeah.
of design.
Yeah, but the more that you do that there, because the surveys or vocalizations or things of that we do with people are useful up to a point, but I got to go to the TV show House and the motto there of everybody lies.
Yes, that's true. But they lie more in the interviews than they would in the contextual.
Correct. While they're doing, people aren't creative enough to really come up with good lies
on
in
the
the
spot.
moment. Yeah, exactly. Like, no, really, I was checking out her name badge. Were you looking at the cleavage, dude? No, it's the name badge. I swear.
Reading is hard in VR.
It is. It
Yeah.
is. Surprisingly, you have to look at it from many angles. So you get more of a sense of honesty from tracking, and the better we're able to
The
track.
heat maps and the data.
Yeah, the heat maps, and then that just becomes, okay, back to, is it usage or sure? The job of the designer then, if what you're going to be doing is learning from them, is just put out a whole bunch of different iterations of things to see which one resonates.
Which is the blob of spaghetti that will stick?
So the A/B testing of the game design
Multivariate testing, big time, yeah.
Yeah. But that is one thing that I still think that in the games industry, people still struggle with it because there's so much of a time pressure to ship. So it's like, hey, we got to slow down. We got to do research, and that means you've got to go and get an external house, because a lot of game developers, they don't have that luxury of somebody in-house that A, knows how to do it, and B, knows how to do it right. And that's like, wait, we got to slow down development. We've got to ship in 5 months. We can't do this. So a lot of what happens in the game development area is that the only time that you actually do the focus testing and the research is at the end of the cycle, when you have no ability to pivot. So that's something that's what did attract me about UX. It's just like being like, it always felt very disingenuous to work on those kind of projects where it's like, okay, we're not doing research, we're not putting this in front of users. Our designers are making tons of assumptions, and we're all just going along with it without actual data, without actual analytics.
Yeah.
And I just found that to be really disingenuous, and that's why I think that where the power in UX really lies is to create software and experiences that really align with user needs.
Yeah.
So what are the tools that need to be built? You mentioned heat maps being integrated into the game engines, but for the web we have this huge swath of tools for getting really granular data about user behavior. Have the tools been built in 3D, or are they yet to be built? What are the big opportunities there?
I think that there's I talked to a lot of UX designers, traditional UX designers, who are trying to get into VR, and as soon as you say, hey, you've got to learn Unity or you got to learn Unreal, because you have to make something that's interactive and to translate your ideas into VR and put people in the headset, that's where they all get kind of scared. And for a lot, so I think that's a real struggle for UX professionals who may have that really strong research or information architecture or psychology background to get into it, because it's sort of like this secret priesthood that you have to know the tools and have been using the tools for a long time to be able to actually make things happen. So I do see a bunch of I have seen a bunch of tools that are trying to get around this, and some of them are succeeding to various degrees versus others. So I think that, but I don't think that I think you always have to you have to do it in Unity and get the analytics, or you have to get some other external tool that's going to measure the heat maps for you.
Are there any tools you've seen that you feel like do it right, or open up and democratize access to designing interactive experiences?
I mean, I go back to Unity just because Unity has a huge community out there, and there's a lot of, if you are trying to figure out how to do something, there's a lot of people out there that have already done it, and you can find answers, and they have a huge, the Unity store has a bunch of assets, so if you just need to find like, hey, I need a frog, or I need a dog, a talking dog for this VR
I
experience.
need an armchair. I need a front door that opens and closes.
You need a giant sentient piece of talking cheese.
I do need that, actually.
Yes, it is available. Somebody out there has thought of it.
Send it directly to Dave.
Let's bring it back to AI for a minute. I mean, do you think that AI and machine learning and these large data sets that are analyzing what objects are, recognizing mostly in the 2D realm for now, but categorizing, tagging can help make the design of these experiences easier in terms of offering up exactly what we need at the moment we need it, in terms of categorizing and offering up interactions. Like, how do you see that kind of supplementing the creator in designing these experiences?
I mean, I think that comes in more into play in the AR side of the spectrum, because then you're like, when you're in a virtual reality environment, it's kind of it's a closed environment, and you put in there, you can control exactly what goes in there. So there is less of a need in VR to have a sort of sentient AI or machine learning thing that's going to offer up to users, like, this is what this, using image recognition, this is what this object is.
Meaning
right?
It needs to be less reactive to whatever environment you happen to be in. Is that
In AR?
In VR?
In VR. Not necessarily less reactive. I think it still needs to be reactive, but I think that the use cases for machine learning are more compelling in AR, because now you're mixing in the outer world, which is much more highly variable than the controlled holodeck world of a VR environment that you can totally control. Now it's like, okay, how is your app going to react when the dog walks in front of it and it poops in front of you, right? Or is this an orange versus an apple? So I think that as the machine learning and the image recognition gets better, that it can streamline, it can offer up options for, I think that this is this thing, or it may be that thing. So that's kind of where my mind goes when we're talking about the role of machine learning and how it can supplement the experience. The other thing that I'm also thinking of is simulation of, like you said, NPCs, non-player characters, or different types of characters that you encounter in VR. I think that what you're seeing a lot of in especially some of the multiplayer or online gaming space is people using machine learning to emulate the behavior of humans. They observe humans in a sort of like an online gaming environment, and they use that data to inform how artificial combatants or artificial players might behave. So that's a very different shift from the traditional vector or approach of how game creators create AI, which is, let's define a set of rules and have it just kind of like a state machine, right? Like have it go and react or go through these set of rules. Machine learning is a slightly different paradigm, where it's much more based on observing real world people, or how real world people behave in an environment.
So we're going to get AI griefers in games now?
I mean, there's a lot of trolls out there, man. So
True
if our creations are going to mimic the creators, then
don't let those go into Skynet, or we're all screwed, man.
Yeah.
That does segue really nicely into something I wanted to get at, which we've been talking about standalone, isolated VR and AR experiences for the most part. But humans are inherently social, and some of the most compelling experiences I've had are social VR experiences. So how do we go about designing these in a way that plays to our better sensibilities as humans, and doesn't, I guess, kind of bring out our baser instincts? Because, I can only imagine the Twitterverse visualized in VR. That's a scary place, right?
Oh, yeah.
Very
Reddit and 4chan in VR are not things that I think anyone really wants to see, unless you have a serious personality defect. Wherever we go, there we are. This is the problem and the challenge with building any of these new platforms here. It's going to come from what AR does, what machine learning does, which is it just basically observes human being was put into situation A with B, C, and D in front of him, and then chose, choices X, Y, and Z behavior. How many humans with this profile in this situation at that place did this. That's basically what web analytics is doing, and that's what machine learning is. You know, the people from Poughkeepsie came to the e-commerce website at 3 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon, and they all bought, you know, blue T-shirts. Well, hey, look, you know, let's see where else this blue T-shirt buying behavior, you know, manifests. That's, you know, that's what machine learning does. What we're trying to see right now to like tame this beast, and you know, the famous example was, I think Microsoft had that little chat bot that within a day was like, Tay was spewing like neo-Nazi propaganda at everybody. Yeah, when we're all collectively training the AI, we do need to put some filters in there so we don't train the AI to be a genocidal murder bot.
Yeah. Sadly, it's reflecting kind of who we are as a race or a species.
Yeah.
As you said, wherever we go, there we are.
Yeah.
Indeed. What was the original question again? How the hell are we going to design?
Social.
How are we going to design so that we don't get this bad outcome?
Compelling social experiences. You know, I read an interesting article today that said on VR chat or some of these other platforms, you know, their cyberbullying is translating, and that's not surprising in any way. But cyberbullying in an embodied experience is a lot tougher of a thing to grasp and wrangle and deal with. It's quite uncomfortable compared to cyberbullying on a social media network, right?
Well, one of the things, and we've actually worked with the Canadian government and the Mounties up there on cyberbullying projects, and one of the things that is different about bullying on cyber platforms, on digital platforms, as opposed to real life, is something that you kind of touched on there, which is really interesting. One of the things that causes cyberbullying to really go over the top is, in the real world, if a bully is kicking somebody who's laying on the ground crying and curled up into a ball, unless that person is freaking Hannibal Lecter, at some point the bully is going to see this person as helpless on the ground, and they stop kicking them. In the digital realm, you never get that view, that vision of the person, you know, being collapsed and really being hurt by what you're doing. And so that's why the bullies just keep on piling on, and that's why it's so noxious.
There's no spatial empathy there.
And maybe, you know, this is an interesting school of thought, that maybe if there is that kind of feedback in VR, AR, maybe that will trigger that human impulse that's in the back of our heads, that you know, we do have this switch in the back of our heads in human behavior that says don't kill other human beings.
Not everybody has that.
Not everybody has that.
But spatial empathy is an interesting idea to explore. Can you expound on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of like the idea that when you're seeing another human-like figure, that you project yourself onto that figure. That you're like someone who has empathy it would be very easy to understand what, if I was in their shoes, what would I be thinking, what would I be feeling. When it's just a little rectangle of text on your phone, that it's a tweet or a comment on a Facebook post, there is no spatial empathy, because it's just something on your phone. It's really disposable. You don't care. But if the person is actually there in person, and you know, that's with VR. I mean, that's one of the most compelling, the presence aspect of it. That's really like what is one of the really most compelling use cases of it, and it's very powerful. I've seen a lot of use cases and apps that are like 360 videos. One of the common ones is, I remember I was down in Santa Monica, and there were people from PETA, and they were having people put on VR Google Cardboard so they could see a 360-degree video of what it's like to be a chicken in a chicken farm. And so the capacity for VR to create empathy, because it is literally putting you in some other person's shoes, is immense. So when I talk about spatial empathy, it is if you are in a space with another person, and we're getting closer and closer to having these really highly realistic characters that, you know, you're not in the uncanny valley anymore. They're actually, you know, something that you can feel some sort of spatial reaction to. That's all coming. And so I think that the cyberbullying in VR issue is definitely going to be a concern. And I think that there's going to be so on some level, you know that it's not real, even though it's kind of tapping into your brain and your visual processing cortex in a way that's saying to your brain that it is real or real-ish. So I don't know. I mean, I think it's scary on one hand, but I don't know. You look like you wanna hop in.
Well, I was going to say, you're making me think that there are going to be some of the, the Reddit type, troll type behaviors, people who get off on being sadistic, nasty, and mean. But by and large, I think that VR is going to allow us to much more quickly, one, identify that, and then two, also, when you're talking about empathy, one of the things that we found that really helps with the bullying is if you see one of your friends being bullied like this and you see it, happening in front of you, yes, you're going to rush to that person's defense. And that is one of the best, mitigating factors to bullying, which is having the other kids in the school help the kid who's being picked on by the mean kids.
So building user agency into these experiences to be able to intervene, or at least
and tell somebody, hey, cut that out. That's not cool anymore.
We'll have AIs that are going to be your interveners for VR cyberbullying. That they're going to show up and be like, hey, don't do that. It's actually surprising too, because I work a lot in online games, and there's so many systems that have to be designed and to take into account bad human nature. What do you do when you have griefers, or you have people who don't play by the sort of unspoken social rules and don't adhere to social etiquette in an online or virtual context? I mean, we're all figuring this stuff out.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I brought it up, because I feel like, as we're amassing these large data sets, which are only going to get more complex with 3D interactions, it's important that we somehow catalog the biases in this data, right? And have the algorithms that are analyzing the data be aware of the biases, feed that in.
Not just the biases, but, what is human nature in every game? What's the first thing that players do when they get in the first gaming environment? Well, how do
Teabag.
Yeah, how do I die in this game? Do I die if I run over this cliff? Do I die if I run at the whirling blades and knives? And so people are testing their environments, and this is basically a recapitulation of childhood.
Play.
It's play.
Spaces.
Yeah, it's okay. Where are the boundaries to this environment? What can I do before I get negative feedback? How bad is that negative feedback? What happens if I push that negative feedback too far? Okay, reset. That's going to be one of those things that we're obviously going to be, having to figure out how to give to people, how to give negative feedback to people to discourage the behavior we don't like in such a way that it changes that behavior, but doesn't completely make them go, okay, I'm done with this.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it creates a space where you can actually have a user experience that's positive.
Absolutely. And I want to end on a positive note here, because we kind of went down a rabbit hole there, but I feel remiss in not asking you two, who really span all aspects of this field, but what does the future of the internet look like in mixed reality?
Snow crash. We talked about this a lot. The metaverse, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I would think that the internet that we know it has kind of evolved out of books and reading, right? It started, you're just kind of fluidly going from topic to topic and reading and consuming content, looking at images and then looking at video, right? So I think that whatever that environment, whatever that VR internet looks like, it has to allow you to really seamlessly browse from different types of environments and worlds. If you have to kind of back out into a menu and again clicking on rectangles or typing in text, which is also not a good experience in VR, I think that we're not leveraging the potential strengths of the medium. I really think the great, it still keeps coming up, but the really relevant use case is the holodeck. They talk to the computer in the holodeck. They say, computer, load program, Riker Delta 2178, or whatever, but they're not, they're not interacting with buttons and things like that. They're talking to it, and it's just this very seamless, hey, I want this. Okay, boom. create this type of object or person in an environment, change this parameter. And so, yeah, I think once you get that confluence of the machine learning that can control the environment, that you can interact with it, and the virtual environment from the technology. I mean, to me, I feel like the VR internet is going to be like the holodeck.
Yeah. I mean, to me, where I look at it right now is going back old school to gaming, thinking about the old text-based adventure games where you had to type in on a keyboard, pick up magic wand, walk forward, walk west, walk east.
You were eaten by the Gru.
Yeah, you're eaten by the Gru. We're at that level right now with VR and AR. We're getting to where there's a clunky interface here. We know what we want to do, and we're still kind of wrestling with the interface to get to the level control that we have now with, gamepads where it's intuitive and you learn, up, down, right, left, push, whatever, to make this character there do things very, very rapidly in the adventure game
that's intuitive for a certain demographic of
Indeed.
people.
Yeah.
Not for grandma, not for your 6-year-old daughter or whatnot.
Yeah, that then is the other part of it, which is the casual gaming idea, which the idea that you could, if you went back to the junior high school me and told me that I could have like a computer in my pocket that would have every single arcade game ever made that I could play.
Every movie ever made.
Every song ever sung, every book ever written in my pocket, wherever I was, all the time, everywhere in the world, I would have been like, okay, fine,
You're on crack.
Yeah, dude. But where the future of this goes, to me, the interesting thing is it's becoming more integrated into our daily lives because it's the presence there is always there. How do you settle, a trivia question? People pull out their smartphones and type in a search query. Okay. In the future, are we even going to have to do that? No, it's going to just pop up on our goggles or our glasses or our contact lenses or whatever it is that we're wearing to, view the world through. We're going to have context-sensitive things where we won't need to ask a query, or when a query happens, we won't need to go through these clunky interfaces to get the answer that's relevant to us.
What role do you think this 30 years of 2D web development will play in a 3D spatial computing world?
Boy. Well, I think that when you look at how the mobile phone disrupted computing pretty significantly.
Yeah.
So, there were touchscreen devices before that, but it was just the combination of cellular technology, form factor, touchscreens, processors getting smaller, more powerful.
Displays
all these
getting
things,
bigger.
Yeah, all of these things enabled that to happen. So I still think that we're moving towards that with spatial computing, where the VR and the AR and the machine learning and all of these things have to kind of align in a form factor and price that works. Because I think that the rectangular media and the rectangular UX, that's going to be around for a very long period of time. And it may never actually go away completely. We still read books.
We still use calculators with tape.
Yeah, exactly. They don't go away completely. They have their place, but it's just the other forms kind of arise to become more prominent. So for me, I think that when AR and VR are on the same device, the form factor is not this big bulky hunk of plastic that I put on my head. It's something that's lightweight and fashionable, and it is either self-contained or there's a small device in my pocket that powers it either wirelessly or through a thin wire, and it becomes a fashion status symbol, and the price is good. I think that's when it will really break through mainstream, when it becomes aspirational. Because I think right now, it may be aspirational to a certain segment of the populace, but the form factor and the sort of, I guess, the ergonomics of it are still prohibitive, and it's not something that you're going to walk in public and do. People don't think anything about bringing out their phones in public to do things. So it needs to get on that level in terms of form factor, price, convenience, ergonomics. All of those things need to happen first. So I still think we're quite a ways away from that. And so the rectangular media will still have its role until then.
The question about what is going to translate from the 2D internet to 3D realms, the things that we've learned about what people want to do and how they want to do it.
The analytics.
Yeah, and looking at, okay, just things like browsing habits. How long do people spend on a page? How deep down do they scroll? What is it that we can do, to get people to walk along this little funnel to get them to do what we want them to do? And that's what, sales funnel or conversion or whatever else like that. That's
do you see it laid out in space along a z-axis where you are now walking down the long lead sales funnel?
When you go to the
virtual... This page has been going on forever.
Well, I mean, that's
just
what
won't end.
I mean, that's
where's the offer?
That's what supermarkets are, for God's sake. I mean, do you know why Piggly Wiggly is called Piggly Wiggly?
I don't.
It's a grocery store, and it was designed after a pig slaughterhouse, where the pigs go down the little rows and the little wiggly.
Truly horrifying.
Man, you just keep going
dark stuff. And then where the cash registers are, that's where you get slaughtered, guys. Moo ha ha ha. No, look. Once again, we're looking at how are we adapting the existing to this new setting here. For 2D websites, the things that we found there that are compelling are. And the mobile web, the three things that we use the mobile web for, one is connecting with each other, either making phone calls or text messaging or social media apps. The second one is saving time or money. We got a map up there. It's telling us with Waze how to get to the place we're going very quickly. We've got Yelp that's telling us the restaurant that's got the deal, whatever else, people showrooming in stores to find out, is this the best price on this jacket? And then the third thing is killing time. Entertainment. And these are the three things that people use their mobile devices for. And you can see that use case anytime there's a line. What's the first, or people are waiting for somebody, the first thing they do, yank out the smartphone and then start using it to either kill time or connect with somebody else or do something else like that to be productive if they're really virtuous.
Yeah, I mean, the real opportunities to me seem, field of view being much larger and information density. Like the opportunity for the density of information and the speed of navigation is, a whole another level of efficiency when we go to a 3D space, as long as it's intuitive.
Yeah.
And so what that looks like in terms of navigating the data that's driving these web pages, I can only guess, but maybe you guys have some thoughts on, what that may look like or what you hope it looks like. What do you really want to see in this mixed reality as you go about your day?
I mean, I think that the whole fantasy of virtual reality has been about entering this idealized world. I mean, back in the 90s with all these movies, it was always about escaping the real world and going into this somehow more perfect, amazing virtual world. It's you look at The Matrix or you look at Lawnmower Man or all these kind of, 90s movies that really danced around this idea. So I think that our reality is pretty broken. It's pretty messed up. And if we can use the power of virtual or augmented reality to maybe just kind of like escape or filter out a lot of the bad and go into a world where we can see the information that we most need, or that, that's kind of my thought about it, is that if we can kind of, it's filtering, right? It's showing the information that you most need, or providing, I think a lot of the real compelling use cases for augmented reality, I think you asked this question earlier and we kind of went a different tangent with it, but I think there's a lot of really great and amazing use cases in healthcare, where you can do like simulations of operations, or even if it's just like if you have children who are undergoing chemotherapy and you can use augmented reality or virtual reality to give them that escapism. Even if you have that kind of use case in that moment and you're making a difference in the lives of kids or something like that, I think there's a lot of power in that. So
yeah, but I mean, medical applications, the the idea has been like, hey, can we have an AR overlay on the goggles that will allow somebody to do like surgery when there's no hospitals nearby, and that's really cool, except for the part where like little paperclip comes out that says, I see you're trying to like remove an appendix. Would you like some help with that? Die, Clippy, die!
But there could be a use case where it's like, hey, this doctor, he's got some sort of augmented reality interface, and using his natural motion controls,
right, the intuitive interface,
and that information's getting sent through the internet to a robot in another part of the world or the country that's actually doing the surgery.
The military's all over that one already.
Oh yeah.
Yeah,
for sure.
They're on.
They're using that to kill people. So
no, they're using that to save people with the clothing with the sensors in it, where a guy gets like blown up or shot up, and they
know what's going on.
They have these like things that look like a big armored coffin on treads that goes out on the battlefield, scoops up the wounded guy, puts him in there, and it's like a surgical theater inside of this thing that like stops the bleeding and sews them up long enough to get back to a field hospital where they can get a human on it.
Yeah.
That and you can see all kinds of uses for that. Guys working on oil rigs in the middle of nowhere, or people out in remote places, or people in neighborhoods where the ambulances can't get there because the traffic is so shitty. Yeah. In like a big city like Bangalore or Los Angeles, for that matter. Mm-hmm. Getting to your point about backtracking a bit to information density, that's a really interesting point, that you can display a lot more to people, but then you start getting into that thing which we were talking about, which is information architecture, which is if you put too many choices in front of somebody, they just shut down.
Right, cognitive load. Only
and then being able to make the choice there. We've all, how many times have we heard, it's going to be like Minority Report. The interface is going to be like Minority Report. Well, you need that kind of intuitive control tuning where you saw Tom Cruise like moving his hand back and forth in an intuitive way to like go forward and backwards in a scene there, and that works if it's responsive. If it starts having a lag time there, or it starts overcorrecting where the first interfaces that we do with everything, there's a problem with the interface. It's either going too fast, or it's going too slow, or it's not doing the thing we need it to do. And that's where the design comes in. Which one works? Is it twisting your hand back and forth? Is it moving it forward and back in space? Is it, scrolling, pinching, zooming, all these things? What are the gestures that we make with our hands? There's only so many things that we can do with, these appendages that we have attached to our shoulders.
In meat space.
Meat
space appendages.
Yes. Oh, very nice.
Yes.
Well, hopefully we can evolve beyond meat space eventually.
No,
we'll start with embodied.
The only way we can escape
interfaces.
meat space is through virtual reality.
There we go.
Have you been watching Ready Player One? Is that it?
Not yet.
I think that's a perfect end note. I've been trying to suss out this whole interview who the optimist and who the pessimist is, but I don't know. You guys have both been throwing me some curveballs, so I think we're going to have to do a round two sometime.
I would love to do a round two. Thank you.
Very cool.
Thanks for bringing us.
Guys, thank you so much for joining, and look forward to deep diving on all of this further.